Alright everybody, so hopefully you saw the first video that I posted on this project. This alien egg sculpted tumbler is turning out absolutely awesome, and it's getting more and more intense as I go through this process, adding more details, different variations to it to make it just an even cooler piece of artwork. So this is video number 2, and this is where I'm going to go ahead and paint the majority of the tumbler. And then video 3 will be the cup topper, and then video 4 will be the base, and then in video 5 I will paint the cup topper as well as the base that this thing is going to sit on. So you'll be able to use this as a diorama to sit on your shelf, or you can throw a twist lid on it and drink from the thing with a straw. So it's just kind of like a multifaceted type of project where you can kind of use it for whatever the buyer wants. It's just something really fun to put together. I put a lot of work into this thing, and we're going to really jump this portion of the video off with me painting the armature legs, which I will add here in a little while to the tumbler. So I wanted the alien to be slightly a pale olive color, kind of like a bluish green tint, a very light color that will contrast against the raw umber, kind of wood teak look of the egg itself. So I'm base coating these in a raw sienna, and then I'm shading them with a burnt umber, and I'm also mixing in a little bit of Mars black as well, just to darken those crevices that I had scraped into the clay before baking. And those just give it a little bit of life when I come in here in a minute with a pale olive and a titanium white mixture just to do some dry brushing. And I will also use a washed out Mars Black in the joint of the arm to make it look like that second joint of the arm is going into the first, kind of like a crab inserted leg. I know there's a scientific name for that, but I didn't want to speed up the video here any more than I had to. If I speed it up any more than I am right here at 150 speed, then it will actually make it to where it's hard to track my movements. So here I am coming in with a little bit of that dry brushing. I start off with a light titanium white, and then I actually bring in a little bit of that pale olive after the fact. So the titanium white just gives you that base that the pale olive and titanium white mixture can kind of latch onto. And then on the underside, where I know that I'll shade and I want that shadow to be, I'll come in with a little bit of burnt umber and pale olive to create just a shadowed version of the same color. I'm just going to keep layering on these colors until I get the desired effect, and then I come in with a pure pale olive on the very top, and that's where I get those little highlights of really, really nice teal bluish color. Alright, so that's the first armature leg completed, and I'm going to let that completely finish up drying while I knock out the other 3 legs. Next, I'm going to go ahead and do the tail. I don't feel like you need to sit through the same process over and over again, so I did do those other 3 legs off screen. So the tail, like I said in the previous video, is kind of like a scorpion look to it. It's just a jointed tail that's going to come out of the bottom port of the sculpted tumbler. I've already base coated this with a raw sienna, and now I'm going to go in and start shading it with different layers of Mars black as well as burnt umber until I get the desired effect I want on the base brown color. I did texture this after the joints were sculpted with a net type of pattern. So that all of this wet on wet blending is settling into those grooves, and when I do the dry brushing, it really makes those scale-like features pop. So I have this sitting on a piece of parchment paper here, and I'm doing a really wet on wet technique. So I'll just paint a little bit, I'll turn it, let it dry, and then as soon as it's barely drying, I'll apply more layers until I get the overall desired effect that I want. Now that paint may darken a little bit as it dries, and that's okay. The whole point of that is just to get the base built up so it gives it a little bit of depth before I put any dry brushing to it. Alright, so here's a close-up of how that looks. It's just really wet on wet blending. I'm going to go ahead and let that dry just a little bit, enough for me to handle, and then I'm going to start applying some titanium white highlights. You don't have to apply titanium highlights to something like this, but because that pale olive is such a light color, if I apply it directly to that burnt umber, it really wants to darken it out more than I want it to be. I want this to be very closely shaded, the same as the legs. I did paint these at two different separate times, but I'm using the same color code. And then I'm going to continue the dry brushing with titanium white down the length of the tail. As I bring that dry brushing in, you can really see the netting that I had applied, the net texture popping. And that just really gives a really cool scale effect without actually having to do a whole lot of work. You just push the texture into it and then it holds it after it's baked. I'm going to bring up those tones from titanium white into thicker applications of the pale olive as I move along through this process, and then I will bring in some burnt umber and pale olive in combination to give shadow to the underside of the tail, because I do want it to be shaded so that the bottom side of that, where that light may not be touching, is darker than the rest. So next I'm going to go ahead and apply a base layer of yellow ochre to this. This is the oozy, icky color scheme I'm going with for all of the liquid runs. So I went ahead and applied that just the tip where I'll apply an epoxy drip later. Alright, so now we're going to roll into the main part of the tumbler. I'm going to give everything a really thorough wash of burnt umber as a base, and then we'll build up layers from there using Mars black, burnt umber, and raw sienna to build up those layers before I go into any other detail colors. Now, during this video, I'm only working with 1/3 of the cup. Majority of this video is in 600% speed, so you can see how much time I truly have invested in painting this tumbler. Now, of course, I was using the tumbler, the first zone of the tumbler, as my color palette, and color swatching the colors as I go. So some of the colors evolve over time, and once I know what color combination that I want to go with for majority of the tumbler, the other two sides, as I work my way in stages around the tumbler, work pretty quick. And if I do come back later on and make another one of these, it gets even faster and faster because I already know that color combination that I want to use for that palette. I'm going to go ahead and also bring in the Mars black towards the top, and I'm going to apply shadow underneath of the lip that's peeled over. Just building up those layers as I go, kind of thinking about where I want the shadow to be, where I want highlights to be, bringing in those darker undertones, and then I can build up layers from there. You can see here where I'm applying some of that Mars Black. This is pure Mars Black, just watered down a little bit, so it kind of gets in the grooves that I had sliced in below the barnacles, where I want that yellow ochre drip to be. So I'm just building up the shadows with Mars Black along the outside edges of those ribs and below the barnacles, and then I'm going to continue shading around different areas as I go. Here I am bringing in some of that raw sienna, which is just that lighter brown tone. I'm going to use a lot of that for the highlights and just to bring the tones up over the burnt umber. So I'll just layer those in until I get the desired effect that I want. I want the outside of the tumbler to kind of mimic bark. Not really so textured as bark, but just like the overall color theme. Because what I plan on doing is I plan to build a base for this, and I would like for that base to have maybe like a log or some ground texture, and I want the tumbler to feel like it's blended into the base where it's sitting. And then I may continue the epoxy ooze out and off of the tumbler so that it feels seamless. So I want this to be a tumbler or a alien egg tumbler that you were walking through the woods and you just stumble across it and you're just like, wow, what is that? And it kind of draws you in, and then it gets you. Alright, so now I plan to bring in some other color combinations to kind of bring up some of those tones. Now, just remember I'm experimenting with the color combinations here because this is just my open palette. I'm just mixing on the tumbler as I go, and if I like the color combination, then I'll continue on with it. So I'm just layering in different browns, a little bit of titanium white, and then I'm going to figure out how I want to use that hooker green. I end up using the hooker green underneath the kind of the shaded areas. Just to apply a little bit of shine and a little bit of highlight, and then I actually use some of that raw sienna to bring up the tones of that raised exoskeleton area. So you'll kind of see me work through the building up the layers there until I really don't see the clay anymore. So if you mess up a color or something on any kind of clay work like this, you can just keep building colors until you just get the desired effect, because you have to build up those layers anyways. So when you build up those undertones, you really get to experiment with how you want it to look in the final stages. Alright, so you can see I'm kind of just paletting out my colors of the trypophobia holes, kind of experimenting how I want those colors to blend. I ended up using a titanium white and raw sienna mix, and then I brought in burnt umber at the top where that kind of eyelid shape is. And then I wrap around to the bottom where I apply a little bit more burnt umber and hooker green in combination with the hooker green that's kind of highlighting around the exoskeleton there. And I'll continue bringing up those tones even more along those raised edges of the exoskeleton. Alright, so I'm also going to bring in some little highlights of titanium white here. This is the smallest amount of paint that you can apply, really. It's just going to give highlights if I want to come in later and apply a little bit more hooker green, just to bring up those different color variations a little bit, create like a moss effect, because I do plan to maybe apply a little bit of flocking to this, just to give it a simulated raised texture, mossy look. Not a whole lot, just a little bit, so that if you were really up on the tumbler, you can kind of see that detail under the epoxy. If you're looking close enough, at a distance you won't see that. I'm just bringing up some of those highlights. Some of these highlights will also be going over in the raw sienna to bring up those lighter color browns, and it just kind of gives it a shine on those raised parts. So one thing that I had trouble doing right away when I got to this stage is these 3 fangs coming off that upper lip from the top of the tumbler. I wanted to add a little bit of prehistoricness to it. I wanted to add some variation in the color, and it just to be something different. It was just something cool that just broke up the overall spin of the cup all the way around, so it's not all the same. So I built up some layers there, and like I said, I'll build up the layers and then I'll come back and add highlights later. I wanted it to have like a really pale yellow to titanium white fang effect. I didn't want it to be super yellow, and I had trouble getting the color combination I wanted, but I finally settled on just a pale white gray, which I come back and layer. But I just had a lot of trouble figuring out what color that I wanted there, and that's really the only item on the tumbler that has the titanium white truly visible on that. Here I am painting the base layer of those the lip around the upper part. On the other sides of the lips, I actually do the red highlights before I do the color overtone of the outside lip. So you'll see that later on I change things up when I become faster at painting this type of tumbler. Alright, so here I am bringing in some more shading on those fangs that are coming down, the tooth, the fang, the claw, whatever you want to call it. And again, building up layers, but I just really was not happy with how it was coming out. I tried to do some dry brushing on it, and it just wasn't giving me the effect that I wanted. So I yet again come in later and I apply more layers. So right now I'm applying pure titanium white to those yellow ochre drip highlights that I put in. I didn't feel like they were bright enough. So when I apply that titanium white highlight there, let it dry, and then come back with the yellow ochre after, it brings up that tone even more and it makes it brighter. And I really do layer that in as I detail it towards the end of the tumbler. So I come in more and more and more, and I add more layers of the yellow ochre to bring up that texture and that thickness of that drip. Alright, so this probably is one by far the most fun parts of this build. Painting the rolled over lips that are at the top of the tumbler. I was really tempted to put in some teeth on this so that they had a really sharp effect, but I really felt like if somebody was going to drink out of this, then those teeth are very likely to get broken off because they're sticking out so far from the tumbler, and the epoxy does have trouble reaching those upper raised edges. If it was just the diorama on a shelf, then for sure would have put spikes in this bad boy. And I may do that later on when it's not a piece of drinkware, you know, when it's just a piece of art that's on a shelf for fun and a display piece, then that's okay. So I'm going to build up Mars Black on this. This is pure Mars Black. And I'm pushing that into those details to get it full coverage, and then I'll let this dry. And then I will go over this with rose red, which is a very vibrant pink, to bring up some of the metallic pink color, and then I will start layering in permanent alizarin crimson and cadmium red in different hues, along with Mars Black to shade that. So we're going to let that dry. We'll come back to that later with those red tones, but just remember that all of those reds are really watered down so that they fill in those grooves and they leave those raised edges dark. Alright, so now I'm going back over that titanium white highlight with some more yellow ochre. And you can see when I bring it in this time, it's just a little bit lighter. It's more visible, it's a little bit thicker, and it's raised up more off of that base layer. It gives it more dimension, and it makes it easier to see. Now I'll come in every so often and I'll add a little bit more to layer that up more and more and more, because I don't want this to be part of the epoxy drip. So the epoxy drip that will come from the top and from the tail, I don't want to have to keep layering epoxy drip over this as well, because that will wash out too many of those detailed browns and hooker greens that are mixed in there. So all of this is just paint. So I'll layer that in right there, and then we'll move on to the next stage. Alright, so let's bring some color to those lips, the rolled over lips that is. This is just a rose pink color. It's very vibrant when you put it against that Mars Black background base. I really didn't have to do this step. I just felt like layering in an additional pinkish to red tone under the reds that I'm going to build up here in a moment. And this is not pure paint. You can see this is very watered down, so it just sits in the grooves that I had carved in or sculpted into the clay. And I'm just going to build this up in kind of a, just a watered down thick mess, and I'll let that completely dry before beginning to layer in the reds. Alright, so let's layer in some of these darker reds here. Now this is permanent alizarin crimson, a very vibrant deep red. A lot of artists don't really like alizarin crimson. I do. It's just a darker version of cadmium red in my book. So I'm going to layer this in, very watered down again, but I'm not watering it down as much as I did the previous pink layer. And I'm just letting that sit in the grooves. Let it lay where it lays. If there's a little bit of overlap on that bottom tan lip, then that's okay. I can always come back with a little bit more raw sienna and do an overtone of that to bring those brown tones up again. I'm brushing off the raised edges so that it can bring some more darkness to it, kind of get some of that red off those raised portions. So there's kind of what it looks like as of right now. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring in some Mars Black. I'm only going to do a light little bit here. I don't want to bring the shade tones down too dramatically. It's okay if I come back and add a little bit more as I go to get the depth in those little wrinkles the way that I want them. So I don't want to bring it in just like a big glob of paint and then not be able to work that out. I can always bring in the darkness later. I'm going over this a little bit with some alizarin crimson, and I'm also mixing in cadmium red hue to bring that red tone up even more. And that's where you'll really get those really red highlights around the raised parts. There I am bringing in some of that Mars Black in, and I'm doing a wet on wet blend. And it gives it a lot of variation there. Now this looks absolutely incredible when it's wet, right? So when it dries, it gets a little flat. But when I come back and I apply that epoxy layer later on, I'm hoping it will bring a lot of the life back to this paint. Alright, so let's see if we can get these fang teeth that are coming down off that upper lip the right shade. So, like I said, this is my third time coming back to these things. I couldn't get the color tone that I wanted, so now I'm bringing in some pure titanium white in a light glaze, and I'm going to go ahead and begin layering in some burnt umber and Mars black from the top. And I'll gradually blend in some raw sienna to bring up that brown effect a little bit as I go. Alright, so like I said before, it's okay to be messy when you're painting things out. We can always go back over it with another layer and then kind of repair things. So I was really messy with that red rolled over lip effect, and now I'm going to come in, I'm going to go ahead and bring those tones back up again with some titanium white and raw sienna. And then I'll come back with some pure raw sienna and some burnt umber, layering those in, and then I'll also shade with some Mars black around the bottom of the lip, so that way it just kind of blends with the exoskeleton and the rest of the tumbler below, and it just highlights that upper lip even more. Alright, so of course I can't leave the bottom of the tumbler not finished. It's just not my nature to leave things undone if I can avoid it. So I did clay the bottom of the cup just in a flat layer, and I kind of texturized it with a saw blade, a clay saw blade that came in a kit. Just something different, just a really quick effect. And I'm gonna go ahead and really wash it out 2 or 3 times with some browns just to get all of those little dimpled effects covered. And I did come in with a yellow ochre to kind of detail that later. So this is the tumbler, all of it, all 3 sides completely painted out. So it jumped there. I painted 1/3 of it with y'all, and now we have the rest of it painted. This is also where I cut away and I did a TikTok video showcasing some of the features, the painting things that I did. Those are just little highlight clips. This is the full brunt of it, right? So it looks absolutely incredible up to this point. It has the rolled over lip at the top, the exoskeleton, the little titanium white hinted teeth that come from the top, the trypophobia holes with a yellow ochre drip. Then we have the barnacles right here with the yellow ochre drip as well. And then I have those ribs kind of highlighted so they kind of just give variation to it all the way around. And the levels of those kind of highlight lips are just different heights from the bottom. There's the bottom with the yellow ochre, and then I have the port here ready for the tail. Alright, so let's go ahead and start with the armature arms. So you can see I've got them laid out there. They're completely painted out. They all match great. And they look fantastic. So I'm trying a new little process here. I actually used an old medicine plunger here, syringe, and I'm actually injecting the E6000 adhesive into the holes that I had pre-pushed in with the when I was building out the armatures. I apply a little bit of the E6000 to that, and then I put it in place, one at a time all the way around the tumbler. I'm also trying to add a little bit of glue to the bottom where the foot holds on to the tumbler. I just want to apply an extra layer so they don't shift while I'm waiting for them to dry, or up to the point where I can apply the epoxy first layer. Here's the second one, a generous application of E6000, and then here's the second armature arm. fits in there absolutely perfectly. And of course, I forgot to apply some E6000 to the bottom of the foot, so I do come back in a moment and apply a little bit more. Alright, so you can see here I've got the tail marked with an acrylic marker or pen where I want the E6000 to be applied with a popsicle stick. I want to try to have a point of contact at each rib as it goes around the tumbler. That way I can have as much strength as possible up to the point of me epoxying it, which the epoxy will really lock everything in place in a way that the E6000 by itself could not do. So here I am applying this. I ended up applying it and then it slid off, and then I applied it again and it fell off again. It's just one of those things. So I ended up applying a little bit more glue and I got it to stay. Alright, so here it is in all its glory so far. No epoxy drip yet, but we're getting there, closer and closer. So there's the tail wrapped all the way around. There we have the left-hand side of the arms coming off, and then actually the right-hand side is actually underneath the tumbler because I was waiting for that E6000 along the tail to dry. Alright, so here's this epoxy mix that I made up with the yellow ochre. What an awesome color this is. So I went ahead while that was setting up and I applied a yellow ochre acrylic base to the black. I don't know if this is really necessary. I think I could have got away with just a standard black base anyways. Maybe it would add more depth. I'll probably do some experiments to see if I can skip this step next time. And while that epoxy is setting up, I actually built a Lego set. So it takes a little while for that to set up, so while I was waiting, I kind of had some fun with the different project. Fun stuff. Alright, so let's get some epoxy on here. So this is really set up really good. It's really icky and drippy. Now I wanted this to be really messy, right? So I did make a TikTok on this as well with some fun background music, which is all good. And I'm going to do the same thing here. Y'all listen to the background music, enjoy the show. This is just supposed to be an icky, drippy mess. How absolute awesome is this? is so drippy and so icky. Now, normally a lot of tumblers I make, I don't let it get this wild, right? I want it to drip in a controlled manner. But because this is such a slimy, icky type of cup, it's okay for it to get out of control. I want the epoxy to drip on things. I want it to kind of lay where it's going to lay, how it would drip if it was naturally dripping this way, and any excess, I can always come back and cut that off with an X-Acto knife and sand it smooth. I actually end up doing that around the bottom of the tumbler because there's some that's wrapping around the bottom. That way it can kind of sit flat without me having to add so many epoxy layers to get it to do so. I'm applying some to the tip of the tail there. I'll let that kind of drip a little bit, and then I'll kind of pull the excess off. And I actually let this sit overnight, just like it is right here, and I'll let it set up. Here's a showcase of what it looks like up to this point. This is before any kind of base layer of epoxy is applied to it to give it that shine and that wet look, or to enhance any of those colors. What an absolute piece of artwork I've created so far. I am so proud of it, and I'm going to talk so highly of it. My sister actually thinks it's very icky, and that is exactly what I was going for. I hope y'all really enjoyed this video. It was a very long video altogether, and I look forward to making the next segment, which will be the cup topper. So please come back for that. If you don't follow me on here already, please do so, and also follow me on TikTok and check out my Etsy shop at Byerly Studios. Thank you all for watching. Come back again.